Welcome back to Cove Street Boatworks. Today we're going to talk about epoxies and fillers. We use fillers, and manufacturers make many different types of fillers to alter the characteristic of the epoxy to make it more suitable for what we're intending to use it for. We used fumed silica to make epoxy thicken and stand on near vertical surfaces without running off. We used Q cells to be able to make a filler that is very easy to sand and is very light. But these things have sometimes unintended consequences. Any kind of filler you add, whether it's wood flour or whether it's Q-cell or fumed silica, is going to have some impact on the strength characteristic of the epoxy. And we're going to examine some examples of that. Before we get into that, I'd like to thank everybody for responding to the previous video that I had posted on the St. Lawrence launch and about our interest in doing a documentary on that launch. We've had some very good response. We've had a lot of people make commitment to following it, and we've had a lot of people subscribe to the YouTube site. So I really thank you for that. I thank you for the feedback that we've been able to get. I'm in the final stages of trying to make that happen. I think we have located a trailer, and we are just trying to set up the financial end of it so that we can go up and support the documentation and all the activities required for it, which are pretty extensive, especially for a new YouTuber like me that doesn't have a big YouTube budget. I have to pay for this out of my own pocket. So it's a pretty big commitment from my point of view. But I'm excited about the opportunity to perhaps do this. So I'll keep you in the loop over the next probably few days and let you know where we are with this. Let's get back to today's episode, epoxies and fillers. On the deck of this Sunfish that we've been working on, you can see that we've sealed it up. We have fixed all the checking in the decks, and we've put some Q-cell thickened epoxy over areas that were a little bit dinged or where the checks were still open, where we weren't able to fill them with just low viscosity epoxy, and we're going to grind this all down. We use Q-cell because they're hollow phenolic balloons, if you will, and they're very lightweight. They add virtually no strength whatsoever. You add it because it is a very easy to remove filler that is extremely light in weight. So for fairing, it does a really good job. It's not particularly impact resistant, so you don't want to use it in areas of high wear. You'd use fumed silica or something else for that, even in wood dust or wood fiber. But for a deck like this is a perfect application. It just doesn't add a lot of weight, and we're going to be able to grind this with 80 grit paper super quick with an air sander. So we're going to take a cut at that. But we're going to go over on the bench and we're going to take a look at what happens when you're doing laminations and you use the wrong filler. Whenever you're doing laminations, you're usually cutting, in a wooden boat world, we often do a lot of white oak laminations or mahogany laminations, spruce laminations. Woods that are good at gluing, like spruce and cedar and mahogany, and I say mahogany because some African mahoganies are pretty oily and they're not particularly good at gluing, but things like Philippine mahogany, which of course, as you know, is a cedar and not a true mahogany, it glues really well. Cedar, cypress, Doug fir, any kind of spruce, these woods glue really well. Not so much of an issue when we make laminations, but when we're using hardwoods like an African mahogany or like white oak, this can be problematic. The shear strength of epoxy is, I think I can generally say this, and I'm doing this without looking up the specs, but I think the shear strength of a given epoxy is generally at its greatest when there's no filler added in. The more you add fillers in, the more likely you're going to degrade the shear strength capability of that epoxy. And when we're doing laminations that are tightly bent, especially with glues that are particularly difficult to glue, especially with woods that are particularly difficult to glue, it becomes very important that all the conditions are properly met, and that shear strength becomes very important. Now, when we're using laminations in a wooden boat, usually we're laminating frames or we're laminating some kind of architectural piece in the boat, and we're going to use that laminated piece in conjunction with fasteners. This usually gives us a lot of latitude because the fasteners, as they penetrate into those laminations, they're typically perpendicularly put into the laminations, and that gives us a little bit of a relief from that shear force that is on that lamination trying to make it separate again. So we'll take a look on the bench at some white oak frames or parts of frames that I had made up, some of which were done with just regular glue, making very sure that we were careful about making adequate glue to be present there. That's usually why you add a thickener when you're doing laminations, is because when you're using a skip tooth blade, like a 3 tooth per inch blade, so that you have a rough surface when you're doing that lamination, if you're using only just plain epoxy, it may not fill and you may get gaps in there, and that may contribute to a lack of strength. So classically you'd use some kind of lightweight filler to make sure that it had enough volume to stay in place, so that if there were any gaps as you're laminating those thin pieces together, they stayed filled and they weren't starved. The same thing can happen if you're using a wood that's very porous and absorbs a lot of epoxy. The epoxy can penetrate into the wood as opposed to staying in the joint. The joint can become glue starved and it can lose a lot of its strength. This is a primary problem, and this is why we always coat the two pieces that are about to be laminated together and then add some thickened epoxy on top of that to ensure that anything that gets penetrated into that bare wood, there's sufficient volume left when we laminate the pieces to fill any kind of gaps. So we'll look at some examples where I used Q-Cell as a thickening agent in a lamination, and as you can well imagine, something that is this soft and meant to be able to be very easily cut off does not make a particularly good laminating additive, and we'll see the end results of that. And we'll look at just using plain glue, and we'll look at using fumed silica, which does a very good job. I didn't have any examples of wood dust or wood flour, but we'll take a look at that as an additive. It also does a pretty good job at maintaining that shear strength, just like fumed silica does. And there's a couple other products that West System and a couple other epoxy manufacturers make that are equally good at providing enough body to the epoxy and maintaining or closely trying to maintain the shear strength of the epoxy. There's special blends out there now that are strictly for laminating that are formulated so they have a little more body, so you don't really have to add anything to them. But we're just going to look at just regular, plain old two-part epoxy and what you can do to make this very generic product more applicable for lamination. All right, here we have some examples of some laminations. These are not very clean. These are sort of rejects, actually. But you get the idea. These should be about 3/32, so a little less than 1/8 of an inch. These are white oak. If you were using different materials, you could go to different thicknesses. It all depends on how much strength it has when you're trying to do the bend. You don't want there to be so much clamping pressure that it's going to exceed or come close to the shear limit of the epoxy. So the more rigid and strong the wood is, the more narrow or the thinner the laminations have to be. And you can probably see here that the surface of the wood is pretty scored up. Again, using 3 teeth per inch on a 3/4 inch bandsaw blade, it does a pretty good job, the rake in the teeth, of leaving this pretty coarse. And this is really good from a gluing point of view. You don't have to make this any smoother than this. It gives it a lot of tooth to be able to grab onto the laminations. But you do have to make sure that there's a little bit of filler in here, because if you're using a epoxy formulation that's just generic in nature, like just a regular System 3, 2-part to 2-to-1 ratio epoxy, it's not going to have the body to fill this, and you're going to end up with laminations that you can see here. Let me try to get it. You can see the voids in here. And that's because, I tried to do even clamping as much as I could, but you end up with these voids. Now, these voids aren't the end of the world as long as you can see them and they're not inside the piece, which does happen sometimes. But if you can see them like this, then they can be filled with epoxy afterwards, and the strength will be decent. This was done with no thickener whatsoever. This is just bare epoxy on this. So here we have an example of a small frame section that we're making for a Fay & Bowen long deck launch. This goes into the turn of the bilge on a Fay & Bowen long deck. You can see here it's labeled keel, Fay & Bowen, port side, and this goes up toward the shear. So we have the orientation. And you have to make these, you know, every 4 or 5 frames because they're going to vary a little bit. These are white oak. The reason we're doing this is because on a Fay & Bowen 24-foot long deck or the 27-foot long deck, the frames are very, very light and the planking is light as well. They're nothing really but a big canoe. But they have some fairly substantial longitudinal stringers and bilge stringers in them. And this is right where the bilge stringer gets positioned in the boat where the floors are laid on top of, and they have a tendency to break. As the boat moves its way through the water, it does a lot of twisting and turning. These bilge stringers are substantially more stiff than the little tiny frames, and the screws that are fastened into it, they use number 10s, you know, like 1.5-inch screws to go from the bilge stringer into these little small frames. You can see the cross section of the frame here is pretty small, and it tends to break. So rather than pulling the deck and you know, reframing the boat, which is a pretty straightforward process on a Fay & Bowen, but it completely screws the finish and has to be all rebunged, and it is a pretty large task. We cut these in where the frames are broken so that, you know, we can get another 3 or 4 or 5 years worth of life out of it. And these will be scarfed in. We'll cut a nice long scarf on these, probably a 12-to-1 ratio, and do the same thing on the existing frames in the boat. And then pin them in place and then screw from the outside planking into this and, you know, put the bilge stringer back in place. And these tend to hold up pretty well. Eventually, of course, the scarves will break, but you can get a fair amount of life out of it if you're careful with the boat. And when you have a Fay & Bowen, a pre-World War II launch, you have to be careful with them. So this is what happens. And as you saw on the other one, there can be some glue starving. There's just the tiniest bit of it here. This one, you can see we use thick Citropic, so there was a little bit of thickener. And all in all, this is really clean and tight. And it has not delaminated whatsoever. Good on the ends. This is a really good substitute. Super strong. This has been kicking around the shop for months. Because I was done with this section of the Fay & Bowen that I'm working on. So it just never got put in. It was all cleaned up and ready to go, and it didn't laminate or anything. Now, conversely, let me show you what happens when you use Q-Cell as a thickener. You can see that we had more than enough thickener in here. You can see it's squeezing out, but again, it takes a lot of strength to keep this thing bent and closed. And what happens is it wants to relieve itself. It wants to straighten out again. And this is with Q-Cell as a thickener. We had plenty of epoxy in here. Let me take a look here. I think I got one that was wetted out. Yeah, here's one. And we'll take a closer look at this. But this is from a failed lamination. And you can indeed see that it is peppered with epoxy and thickener. So it wasn't starved. It's just that the shear strength of the epoxy when mixed with Q-Cell is very, very low. And it didn't take much strength, much built up tension in these laminations to be able to overcome what was left of the shear strength and make them fail. All right, well, that does it for another episode of Cove Street Boatworks. Thank you very much for your following and participating in these discussions. Thank you very much for all the comments and everything that everybody has left over the past couple of weeks on the St. Lawrence or the St. Lawrence launch documentary proposal. I really appreciate the feedback I've been getting. I've been getting some really interesting feedback from a lot of people, so please keep it up. I do read it, even though I'm not always as quick to comment on it as I should be because I was traveling a lot for the last couple of weeks. But we have some really cool stuff coming up. We have a trip up to New Hampshire to meet a fairly well-regarded canoe restorer. I have never met the gentleman myself, but I've seen photos of his work. His work is extraordinary. He likes to do a lot of early Maine canoes like Garishes and some EM whites. I have a very early EM white here with mortised thwarts in it, and we're going to be trading out this boat, which he really would like to have and restore, for one of his boats, which is sort of the next generation, but still very early, with a D-shaped rear seat, but it has bolted thwarts. I want to use these boats with my grandkids, so it makes sense for me to move away from something that's a little more fragile, like this very early EM White that I have hanging here on the ceiling, towards something that has bolted thwarts, which is going to be a little more forgiving. So we're going to go up, we're going to meet him, we're going to have an opportunity to video some of his restorations that he has there, speak to him in person, get a little background, and then hopefully I can twist his arm and we can go back up there and take a look at the EM White when he's completed the restoration. I expect it's going to be absolutely breathtaking. So that's to look forward to. I'm hoping to maybe be able to do that next weekend. We'll see if we can make everything work out, but that's the plan as it is right now. And we got a lot of cool stuff coming up. I'll be giving you some updates on the St. Lawrence launch negotiations that I'm going through. I'm still trying to tie up some loose ends, still trying to talk my significant other into supporting the effort. She's a hard sell. Her name is Kay, so if anybody wants to leave some feedback, she does watch the channel all the time. Say, Kay, we got to do this. Come on, this is a great idea. See if we can talk her into it. She's still a little bit reluctant. It's a lot of money. All right, until the next episode, thank you very much. See you next time.